January 29th, 2021. A DNA match arrives in a laboratory in Colorado. For the first time in 4 decades, a name becomes possible. But the real question wasn't whether the science worked. It was how a dead database finally learned to speak. David Dwayne Anderson didn't know that day was coming. He was living quietly in Coad, Nebraska, throwing out his trash like any other Thursday, completely unaware that one of those discarded items, a vanilla Coke can, ordinary and unremarkable, was about to erase 40 years of silence. But before we get to that moment, before we understand why a single can of soda mattered more than 2 decades of DNA databases and hundreds of law enforcement hours, we have to go back to 1981. We have to go back to a woman named Sylvia Quail, to the morning her father realized that the routine he'd shared with her every single day was about to become the last thing he'd ever hold on to. Sylvia was 34 years old and lived on South Ogden Street in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, an affluent suburb about 6 miles south of Denver, the kind of place built around money and space, and the kind of quiet that comes when people can afford privacy. She worked as a secretary at an architecture firm in Denver, but architecture was more than a job. Her uncle, Wesley Quail, was a designer, and Sylvia's fascination with how buildings came together had shaped the way she moved through the world. If architecture fed her intellectually, baking was her real language. She ran a business out of her home called The Buttery, creating wedding cakes that required vision and precision, the kind of work that demanded attention to detail and a kind of artistry that doesn't announce itself loudly. Her sister still has the pottery pieces Sylvia threw on a wheel by hand, glazed, and fired herself. Objects made to last. But what mattered most was family. Sylvia had organized her entire life around the people closest to her. Her parents lived nearby on purpose, and every single morning, without exception, no days off, no exceptions, Sylvia had coffee with her father, William. That wasn't a special occasion. That was her life. That was their routine. On the night of August 3, 1981, she called her younger sister around 11 p.m. It was an ordinary conversation, the kind sisters have all the time, about nothing in particular. Neither of them knew it would be the last conversation they'd ever have. When Sylvia didn't show up for coffee the next morning, William didn't hesitate. He walked the short distance to her house. As he got closer, something felt wrong. Both the screen door and the front door were standing wide open. He stepped inside. What he found in the living room fractured something in him that was never fully repaired. Sylvia was on the floor. Her clothing was in complete disarray. A white towel had been placed over her face. His daughter, the woman he'd had coffee with every morning of her adult life, was gone. William called the police immediately. But before they arrived, before protocol and procedure took over, he did something a father does instinctively. He moved the towel. He tried to cover her. He tried to give her some dignity in the worst moment of both their lives. When police arrived, they had to ask him to help recreate the scene exactly as he'd found it. Imagine being asked to do that. To show officers where everything lay, what was disturbed, what wasn't, just minutes after discovering your child. When investigators took over the living room, they didn't find the chaotic hallmarks of a burglary gone wrong. What they found looked controlled, deliberate. Whoever did this had a plan. Over the next few days, detectives collected 140 pieces of evidence from that house. An orange rug from underneath her body. Blood trails leading from bedroom to living room. A bloody knife left at the scene. Fibers, biological material, evidence of forced entry through a bathroom window. A deliberately cut phone line, both inside the house and the line running to the property, which had been pulled down and left lying across Sylvia's Corvette. That's more physical evidence than almost any crime scene in Colorado at that time. 140 items, each one catalogued, each one carrying potential answers. And yet, Standing in that living room in August 1981, detectives had absolutely no idea who had done this. No fingerprints that matched anyone in their system. No name, no suspect. They had everything except a way to read it. They had mountains of proof, with no one to attach it to. If you're finding this investigation compelling, hit subscribe now. We dive deep into cases like this every week, and the algorithm needs your help to reach people who actually care about how these stories get solved. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. That simple comment helps us reach more people. Because Sylvia's case is about to teach us something crucial about the difference between having answers and knowing how to find them. The coroner's report would later spell out exactly what Sylvia endured in her final minutes, and it read like an attack that never stopped escalating. First, there was evidence of intense physical struggle focused on her neck. Investigators found marks proving her attacker had physically overpowered her, using his hands to restrain her before the assault escalated further. But strangulation alone didn't kill her. The attack kept going. Sylvia suffered 3 severe sharp force injuries to her upper back. The trauma was immense. The internal damage from those wounds was ruled as the primary cause of death. On top of everything else, her attacker used a firearm. The medical examiner listed this as a secondary factor, concluding that the earlier trauma had already likely taken her life before this final act occurred. 3 separate methods: strangulation, stabbing, a gunshot. This wasn't someone who panicked and struck once. This was someone who kept going, who stayed committed to an outcome until he was absolutely certain. Sylvia fought back. When investigators processed the scene, they noted her hands were covered in blood, and her fingernails were broken. Near her body, they found a bloody knife. Evidence indicated she had been severely compromised before her life was taken. Blood wasn't confined to the living room either. There was a pool of blood behind the front door. Inside her bedroom, a significant amount of blood was found on her pillow. Drops traced a path between the bed and the bedroom door, suggesting the attack didn't start where her body was found. It started somewhere else in the house and moved through it. What made the crime scene even more unsettling was how deliberately he'd prepared. The killer had severed not 1 but 2 phone lines, the one inside her home and the line running to the property, which he'd pulled down and left lying directly across Sylvia's Corvette. He'd done this work completely in the open, right next to her car, taking a massive risk. Someone had made absolutely certain that no matter what happened inside, Sylvia would have no way to call for help. Even if she'd survived long enough to crawl to a phone, it wouldn't have mattered. The way he'd gotten inside told an even stranger story. Investigators found a small hole cut into the corner of the screen on Sylvia's bedroom window. That was where he tried first, but something about that attempt didn't work, so he moved on. He tried the bathroom window instead, and that's where he finally succeeded. The screen from that window had been completely removed and was later discovered nearly 75 feet away from the house, tossed into a patch of tall weeds. There was a small pry mark on the bottom of the wooden window frame, evidence that he'd physically forced his way through. A random burglar looking for an easy target doesn't try one window, fail, and then calmly move to a second window and force it open. Someone acting on impulse gives up and leaves. This person didn't leave. He adapted. He studied. He moved methodically from one entry point to the next until he found his way inside. Once he was in, investigators believed he took his time. Items you'd expect to find on a bathroom counter were later found scattered directly beneath the window he'd broken through, as if he'd knocked them out of his way without a second thought. Whatever he was doing in those first few minutes inside Sylvia's home, he wasn't rushing. He was deliberate, controlled. The way the scene was arranged told detectives immediately that whoever did this had planned every move. Investigators in 1981 had detail after detail: blood trails, a weapon, evidence of a calculated assault, 2 separate entry attempts, a clear sequence of events that moved from physical restraint to stabbing to a final gunshot. He had left behind biological material, fibers, and an entire timeline of cold, calculated decisions written into the architecture of the house itself. And still, standing in that room, detectives had no idea who he was or where he'd gone. One piece of evidence would matter far more than anyone in that room could have guessed at the time. Underneath Sylvia's body, spread out on the living room floor, was an orange area rug. Detectives bagged it along with everything else, without knowing that this single piece of carpet was carrying biological material invisible to the naked eye. Material that current lab methods in 1981 had absolutely no way to isolate or read. It would sit in storage unremarkable among 140 other collected items, waiting for science to catch up to what was already sitting inside its fibers. Investigators went to work interviewing everyone who knew Sylvia: co-workers, friends, neighbors, people she'd dated. One by one, names got cleared. But one name from her past didn't get the scrutiny it deserved. A man who had a history with Sylvia was mentioned to the police. For reasons that wouldn't come to light for decades, that lead never got followed. At the time, nobody flagged it as a problem. It would take years before anyone realized what had been left on the table. With no suspect and no fingerprints, investigators leaned on the only thing they had: the evidence itself. Years passed. Then, in 1983, 2 years after the crime, a drifter named Otis Elwood Toole confessed to killing Sylvia. Toole didn't just claim responsibility. He described specific details about her property, the trees and hedges surrounding her home, details that sounded like they could only come from someone who'd actually been there. Investigators took his confession seriously enough to formally charge him with first-degree murder. For a moment, it looked like the case was finally closed. But Toole came with a complicated history. He traveled and confessed to killings alongside his companion, Henry Lee Lucas. Between the two of them, they claimed responsibility for an almost unbelievable number of murders across the country. Some of those confessions turned out to be true. Many others didn't hold up under scrutiny. Toole had a documented pattern of inserting himself into cases that weren't his. For 10 years, Sylvia's case sat charged to a man who may or may not have actually done it. Then, in 1993, DNA testing caught up to the claim. The biological material recovered from that rug back in 1983 was compared against Toole's DNA. It didn't match. Toole hadn't been at that house. He hadn't killed Sylvia. The case wasn't solved. It had never been solved. For a full decade, a man who had nothing to do with Sylvia's death had absorbed all of the investigative attention, while the person who actually killed her walked free, unquestioned, unbothered, living whatever life he wanted. With Toole eliminated, Sylvia's case went back to square one. But at least now there was real biological evidence to work with. In 1995, the section of carpet was sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for further testing. It took 5 more years, but by 2000, technicians had developed a complete DNA profile of the unknown man who had left that material behind. For the first time since 1981, they had a genetic fingerprint. It was entered into the FBI's national database, CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, waiting for a match against convicted offenders. Every state fed their criminal database into this system. Every arrest, every conviction that involved a DNA sample was supposed to create a match if that person had ever been caught before. Nothing came back. The killer's DNA simply wasn't in the system. The tool built to trap him was powerless against a man who had never been arrested for anything serious enough to land his genetics in a federal database. He'd been lucky, or be careful, or both. Or he'd simply never been caught for crimes violent enough to warrant a DNA collection. Whatever the reason, the profile sat in that digital void, technically solvable, practically unreachable. It would require the killer to get arrested again for the science to work. It would require him to get caught for something else and have his DNA submitted. It would require a second chance for the system to connect him to the first crime. Investigators didn't give up. Year after year, detectives checked back to a blank screen. They ran the profile against new arrests. They compared it against every addition to CODIS as the years rolled forward. Nothing matched. Investigators moved on to other cases, retired, and were replaced by new ones who inherited the same unanswered file. The rug, the towel, the knife, the evidence. All 140 pieces from that August morning stayed exactly where they had been logged, waiting on a technology gap nobody could close by simply trying harder. 2 decades passed with that genetic profile sitting untouched in the dark, technically solvable, practically unreachable. What it would eventually take wasn't another arrest, another confession, or another 20 years of hoping the same database might finally produce a match. It would take an entirely different kind of science, one that had nothing to do with searching a list of convicted criminals and everything to do with a digital dragnet that nobody investigating this case in 1981 could have ever imagined. In January 2020, 39 years after Sylvia's murder, Cherry Hills Village Police started working with a company called United Data Connect. It was founded by Mitch Morrissey, a former Denver district attorney who had turned his entire career toward a completely different kind of investigation. His team didn't get involved because someone reopened Sylvia's file out of nowhere. They got involved because they just helped solve a separate cold case in Jefferson County. And word reached the detectives still holding on to Sylvia's unsolved murder that this method might finally work where 20 years of database searching hadn't. The approach itself had nothing to do with matching a criminal database. Investigators uploaded the unknown DNA profile from that carpet, the same profile that had sat untouched since 2000, to 2 public genealogy websites, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. These weren't law enforcement tools. They were the same sites regular people used to find long-lost relatives and build out their family history. The unknown killer had never submitted his own DNA to either site, but somewhere out there, distant cousins of his had, without any idea what that decision would eventually unlock. The genetic matches came back, and investigators started building a family tree. It didn't start small. It started with over 3,300 people. An entire web of relatives, second cousins, distant branches, and unrelated names connected only by fragments of shared DNA. Somewhere buried inside those 3,300 people was the answer to a murder that had gone unsolved for nearly 4 decades. Investigators had to work backward through that tree, tracing which branches connected to which families, cross-referencing ages, locations, and criminal histories, slowly eliminating thousands of people who had absolutely nothing to do with Sylvia's death. Eventually, the tree narrowed to one name: David Dwayne Anderson. In 1981, he was 22 years old and living in Englewood, a town less than 2 miles from Sylvia's home in Cherry Hills Village. That distance alone made him worth a closer look. But when investigators started digging into his background, they found something else. Anderson had a criminal record stretching from 1976 to 1988, made up almost entirely of burglaries. In June 1981, just 2 months before Sylvia's murder, he was arrested twice. Then, in October 1981, 2 months after the murder, he was arrested again, this time in Jefferson County, a charge that landed him a 3-year prison sentence. He had been active, close by, and repeatedly breaking into homes during the exact window surrounding Sylvia's death. Investigators still needed one thing before they could move forward. They needed Anderson's actual DNA collected directly, not just inferred from a family tree built on the genetics of distant relatives. A family tree could point to a suspect, but it couldn't convict him. Science had given them a name. Now they needed to prove that name belonged to the killer. In January 2021, an investigator traveled to Coad, Nebraska, where Anderson was now living. This wasn't a knock on the door. It wasn't a formal interview or an interrogation. This was quiet surveillance, watching his routine, waiting for an opportunity that wouldn't tip him off. The investigator needed Anderson to never know he was being watched, because if Anderson destroyed evidence or fled, 40 years of detective work disappeared with him. Eventually, that opportunity came in the form of his own trash. The investigator retrieved bags Anderson had thrown out, and inside them was mail addressed directly to him, confirming whose trash this was. From those bags, roughly 15 items were pulled for potential DNA testing. A water bottle, a bottle of rum, a bottle of beer, and 1 can of vanilla Coke. That Coke can was the piece that mattered most. It was ordinary. It was the kind of thing anyone throws away without a second thought. A man finishes his drink, tosses the can, never imagining that discarded aluminum holds a genetic map that's been waiting 40 years to speak. The chain of custody for that can was documented carefully. Where it came from, who collected it, how it was handled, how it was transported to the laboratory. Every step recorded. Because in a courtroom, the jury won't care if the DNA matches perfectly if there's any question about whether that sample could have been contaminated, mislabeled, or compromised. The physical evidence has to be as reliable as the science itself. The can was tested. On January 29, 2021, lab results confirmed that the DNA on that can matched the DNA profile pulled from Sylvia's crime scene 40 years earlier. An ordinary piece of trash, something anyone might throw away without a second thought, had just closed a case that survived a false confession, a database that came up empty for 20 years, and 2 full generations of investigators who retired without ever learning the killer's name. Anderson was arrested on February 10, 2021, in Nebraska, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was transported back to Colorado. Investigators sat him down for an interview. He denied knowing Sylvia Quail. He denied ever having been to her home. He claimed he had no idea how his DNA could possibly have ended up at the scene of her murder. He offered explanations that made no logical sense. He claimed confusion. He claimed innocence, despite the genetic evidence staring at him across the table. But DNA doesn't explain itself in an interview room. It sits there waiting for a courtroom, waiting for 2 sides to argue over what it actually means. Anderson wasn't going to be able to deny the science forever. His own genetic material had already answered that question. What his defense would need instead was a different kind of argument entirely. Not whether his DNA was there, but what it meant that it was. For 40 years, that Coke can didn't exist. The vanilla drink inside it hadn't been invented. The refrigeration that preserved it was just a concept. The laboratory that would test it was something only science fiction writers imagined. A man threw away a piece of trash in Nebraska in January 2021, expecting it to mean nothing. He had no idea that 1 discarded can would become the physical connection between a murder in 1981 and an arrest in 2021. He had no idea that the silence he'd carried for 40 years was finally about to break. What made this case remarkable wasn't just that it was solved, it was how. Not through a database of arrested criminals, not through a confession or a witness or a detective's deduction, but through thousands of ordinary people who'd submitted their DNA to genealogy websites for innocent reasons, to find relatives, to trace family history, to understand where they came from. Those distant cousins became unwitting witnesses. Their genetic information became the thread that connected the killer to the crime. The question now wasn't whether he did it. The question was what happened next. 40 years is a long time to wait for answers. It's long enough for a 34-year-old woman to stay frozen at that age forever. It's long enough for parents to grow old without ever knowing who walked into their daughter's home and decided to end her life. It's long enough for investigative methods to transform completely, for technology to evolve from fingerprinting and witness testimony to genealogy databases and discarded soda cans, 40 years is long enough for the world to change so completely that the tools which finally solved the crime wouldn't have made sense to the detectives who first stood in Sylvia's living room. When David Dwayne Anderson was arrested in February 2021, Sylvia's family finally had a name. After 4 decades of not knowing, they knew. They knew who had entered her home. They knew who had severed her phone lines. They knew who had chosen strangulation and stabbing and a gunshot as his methods. They knew. But the knowledge came so late that some of the people who needed answers most were already gone. Sylvia's father, William, had passed away years earlier. He never got to know his daughter's killer's name. He never got to see the moment when the silence finally broke. What the case accomplished, though, extended far beyond one family's delayed closure. Sylvia Quail's murder became a turning point in how law enforcement approaches cold cases. The genealogical DNA methodology that solved her case has since become standard practice across the country. Police departments that had boxes of evidence sitting in storage for decades, evidence that had failed to match against criminal databases, suddenly had a new tool. A tool that didn't require the killer to have been arrested before. A tool that could reach into families and extended relatives and build trees of connection that traditional databases simply couldn't access. That breakthrough came with a cost. Privacy advocates raised concerns that had never been raised before. When someone submits their DNA to a genealogy website to find relatives, they're not consenting to law enforcement access. They're not knowingly becoming part of an investigation. The distant cousin, who took a genetic test to trace their Scottish ancestry, becomes an unwitting participant in a murder investigation. Their DNA, which they submitted for personal reasons, becomes a map that leads police to relatives they may never have known about. The question of whether that's acceptable, whether public genealogy databases should remain open to law enforcement, is still being debated in courtrooms and legislatures across the country. But from an investigative standpoint, the impact has been undeniable. Cold cases that seemed permanently unsolvable suddenly had new life. Cases like Sylvia's, which had been investigated thoroughly but yielded no suspect, could be reopened. The orange rug that sat in storage for 40 years finally told its story. The DNA profile that existed in a digital void since 2000 finally found its match. What this case changed is how we think about evidence and time. In 1981, investigators collected 140 pieces of evidence and had nowhere to go with it. The science didn't exist. The databases didn't exist. The methodology for turning distant genetic connections into suspect identification didn't exist. They did their job perfectly. They collected meticulously. They documented carefully. And then they waited. They waited for science to catch up to what they already knew. That the person responsible had left traces of himself behind. Invisible to technology at the time, but waiting to be read by technology that hadn't been invented yet. The case also revealed something uncomfortable about how investigations can go wrong. A man named Otis Elwood Toole confessed to Sylvia's murder and spent 10 years charged with a crime he didn't commit. His confession derailed the investigation during crucial years when leads might have been followed, when DNA technology was rapidly advancing, when momentum might have pointed toward answers. Tunnel vision, the tendency to focus so completely on one suspect that other possibilities disappear, nearly cost an innocent man his freedom. He got exonerated because DNA testing advanced. But the lesson remains. False confessions happen. Investigators can become convinced of guilt that doesn't match the evidence. And sometimes it takes a genetic profile to correct what human judgment got wrong. For Sylvia, there is no closure that feels complete. She stayed 34 forever. Her wedding cakes were never built for her own marriage. Her pottery wheels stopped turning. Her daily coffee with her father became a memory instead of a ritual. But for investigators, for the detectives who refused to close her file, For the technology that finally caught up to what was always there waiting to be found. The case proved that 40 years isn't forever. That patience, combined with the right tools, can still reach across decades and speak truth. That a vanilla Coke can matters more than anyone throwing it away ever imagined. If this case stayed with you, subscribe. Cases like Sylvia's are what we cover every week. Investigations that show us how justice works when it finally arrives, and what it costs when it takes this long. Drop a comment and tell us what you think about genealogical DNA in investigations. Is it a necessary tool for solving the unsolvable, or does it cross a line into privacy most people never consented to? The answer matters, and it's still being written.